I was going to say something, but then I thought maybe I shouldn't say it. No, you're allowed to talk. No, you look great. You look great.
Please raise your hand if you think live admission Is there anyone who purchased a book ticket and has not received their copy of the 1619 yet? Going once, going twice.
And a glass of ice.
Come on. So, didn't know, it was business. I was grandmother for 26. Right there.
The white light? I don't know. Does this white light have to be that bright? It's a little bit in her eyes. Oh, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Good evening, everyone. Am I standing in the right spot? Good. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Busboys and Poets. Pleasure to have you here. This is a place where racial and cultural connections are consciously uplifted, a place where art and culture and politics comes together and intentionally collides, a place to take that deliberate pause and feed your mind, body, and soul. We believe by creating places like this, we can actually begin to transform our community, our neighborhood, and indeed the world. Thank you all for being here. We got some really strict restrictions from the New York Times and kept the numbers low, a number of people here. So you're in for a big treat. This is like a private gathering with someone that has been just blowing up all over the place with her 1619 project. So this is Busboys and Poets, named after the great poet Langston Hughes. And you're sitting here in the Langston Hughes room. This is our first place that we opened in 2005. Langston Hughes is the inspiration behind Busboys and Poets, has been an inspiration to me since I came here to the United States back in 1966. I've always been inspired by his poem, Let America Be America Again, which is written at the top of this mural. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain seeking a home where he himself is free. And he refrains by saying, America was never America to me. Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Let it be the strong land of love where neither kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that no man be crushed by one above. So this is the America that Langston Hughes was writing about in 1936. Not a very good time for a Black man living in this country. And yet he saw the possibilities in America. The possibilities of freedom, of openness, of a dream that the dreamers dreamed. A few days ago, I went and changed my glasses. I needed a new pair of glasses, I realized. And I realized that the glasses I was wearing were not the right magnification, and I wasn't seeing a lot of things. And so it is that when I change the glasses, suddenly the world looks so different, and things look so much brighter, and nuances that I didn't see before started to appear. And so it is, I think, with what Nikole Hannah-Jones has done. She is the historical optometrist of this country. She has been able to put a lens, change the glasses that we've all been wearing, that filter that we've all been seeing this country through is not the true filter of what this country is all about. She has put on a new set of glasses for us to be able to see this country a little differently, a little more nuanced, and yes, a little bit more uncomfortable. But with that comes change, with that comes progress, with that comes advancement. And so it is with Nikole Hannah-Jones, with the 1619 Project. It has become the go-to project. It is one of the few things that has been published that has been outlawed in many states. And it goes to show you, and it goes to show you how important it is. When people start outlawing things, you know that there's something afoot there, right? So that change is happening, but yet I think people are prevailing and saying this is the truth. We like the new glasses, in fact. It shows us what real America is all about. And unless we learn what real America is about, we'll never become the dream the dreamers dreamed, that we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, we need to be able to look at ourselves more closely and see ourselves with this new lens. So thank you so much for being here, Nikole. It's a pleasure to have you here. And we found no better person to do an interview with Nikole than Keisha Sirem. Keisha here, and excuse me for standing in front of her. I'm supposed to be in the light so that the cameras can do what they do. But Keisha here is the Associate Director of an organization that's very familiar to us. I used to be on the board of Teaching for Change. How many of you have heard of Teaching for Change? It's an incredible organization. It's DC-centered, but it brings information and knowledge to teachers, to parents, to students, to make them better learners, to have them look at the world more critically, bringing information about people of color, for America, really, to be able to show what America truly is through the kind of curriculum that they provide for the students. Teaching for Change was also involved, actually, in our first bookstore. When we opened our first bookstore here, I invited Teaching for Change to be the curator for the books. And they have set the standard of what kind of books we carry here. And we've continued to carry the books that they recommend and curate through us. And we continue to reference them and go back to them when we need to see updates and things that we have to do. So thank you so much, Keisha, for agreeing to do this interview. I'm going to turn it over to her, and she will take it from here. We'll have a conversation between the two of them, and then we'll open it up for a little bit of Q&A. So thank you all again for being here.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Busboys and Poets. It's good to be home. It's good to be part of a community like Teaching for Change and have the relationships that we do in this city. So I'm excited to be here and excited to be sitting next to Nikole Hannah-Jones, and just happy to be with you all this evening. So as a reminder, as Andy said, please get your questions because I want to be able to invite you all into the space and the conversation as well. So we're going to jump right in. All right. Cool. I know that you hearken the ancestry of Ida B. Wells, and just thinking about what she has written about the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. Nikole, what does it mean to be a truth teller?
Oh, we just starting with the deep question. Okay. First, I just want to say, hey, everybody. They have me, these lights are like a CIA interrogation right now, so I can't see y'all, but I'm really appreciative of everyone who comes out to hear me talk and to talk about the book, and everyone who has supported the book. It's been a long 2 years. As Andy said, I've been a journalist for 20 years. This is the first time my work has been banned by name in several states, which is both deeply troubling and also probably my greatest badge of honor. That's something that's so dangerous that conservatives feel like they need to ban it from states. And thank you, Andy, for always holding space for thinkers and those who are trying to push this country to actually live up to its ideals. Now I'm going to put my hand down. I'm not going to be able to see y'all for the rest of the talk, but I just appreciate seeing everyone's faces. Truth teller. Andy will tell you, even if it's painful, one thing about me, I'm very candid. I don't believe in sugarcoating things. And we live in a country that has been willfully ignorant and has practiced a willful amnesia about who we are. And this project is really about trying to force a confrontation with the truth, not to destroy the country, as my adversaries would say, but an acknowledgement that we can't move forward as long as we keep undergirding the lie.
Right.
I mean, we think about in our personal relationships, when someone has done something, has wronged us in some way, we can't just move on. We can't go to the family function and just pretend it's okay. We can't patch it over. Like, we need that person to acknowledge what they did. And once they acknowledge it and then repair, then we can move on. And this country has not wanted to, one, just acknowledge the truth about what it's done. And it certainly hasn't tried to repair what it's done. And that's why the wound can never really heal. And Black people are always being asked to forget and to forgive. And we can't do either until there's been some type of atonement. So for me, people call me a truth teller. I just feel like I'm just doing my job as a journalist, which is to try to excavate and get as close to the truth as possible. And that's what the 1619 Project is trying to do.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's things that you've raised both in the origin of the book, the preface, and then just in your own history about what it meant to be a young person and not having the revelation until a certain age. And so I know that you just had your homegoing of sorts and got to go back.
Homegoing.
I'm
still alive, y'all. I wasn't a homegoing.
I had a reunion back home. We'll use that. What was that like, returning home? And what was it like to now sit in the space of recognizing that you are a figure that is now written in the history books that young people in your own hometown get to read about?
So if you follow me at all, you know that I'm from Waterloo, Iowa, which is a no-name town in a flyover state. Shout out to Deshaun, who's my homeboy back from Waterloo. He lives here in DC. We were two Black nerds at our high school, and that's how we kind of bonded. So it was amazing to go back home. And Waterloo is not a place that authors of big books ever come to. And it took quite a bit of work for me to convince my publishing house that we had to do an event there. But I think it's so important because there are Black folks all through these little Midwestern towns and these smaller cities, whether we acknowledge that or not. And growing up there is really what put me on the course to one day produce the 1619 Project. I was bused starting in the second grade into white schools. So there weren't a lot of Black people in my hometown, but there still were enough to segregate us.
Right.
And I just, started noticing through the windows of my school bus every day. I rode the bus 2 hours a day, an hour there, an hour back. I had to leave my neighborhood because my parents believed that leaving my neighborhood and going into a white neighborhood and white schools was my best opportunity for an education. And we always were made very aware that we were visitors in someone else's school. My white classmates could just walk to school. This was their school, and we had to get on a bus. And at the end of the day, we had to go back home. And from a young age, I started to question why that was. Why do we have to leave our neighborhood? Why do I have to have my school friends and my neighborhood friends? Why did everything start to get nicer once we got to the white side of town? And I knew what media would tell us.
Yeah.
Which was Black people just somehow were the only people in America who didn't want better, who didn't work hard, who didn't care about education, who somehow liked neighborhoods that were broken down and unsafe. That's what media would have you believe. But that's not what the people in my community, I saw how hard they worked. I knew the things that they wanted. So having that experience really led me to question why. And studying history explained the why to me. And of course it was, as I talk about it in the preface, my high school, which offered a 1-semester Black Studies course. And I got on stage with the teacher of that course, Mr. Ray Dial, who was the only Black male teacher I ever had. And it was in that course that I just got a little glance at this whole world of Black history that existed that no one had ever taught us. And it just wanted me to learn more. And he's also the person who put the book in my hand that introduced me to the year 1619. And it's kind of a cosmic justice that the very first end note in the book is Jerome Bennett and Before the Mayflower.
That's awesome. I think there's so many pieces about your story and background, and just thinking even the revelation of having only one Black male educator in your history, and thinking about these different moments that we may only have a one or never. And so just what does those moments of confronting those experiences look like? And even what you're saying just about how history shapes a narrative. For me, my family is from Haiti. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest in Ohio, a college town, but still a small town nonetheless. And as a townie, there's, you know who the townies are, you know who are the faces that you know. And just thinking about the ways in which my own family, my parents, my grandparents raised education as a space for us to learn, to know our history, both in Haiti from the stories that they told, but then also the history that we know from what was happening in this country. And that for me is a piece that I'm grateful for my family, having been the ones to be always communicating, you need to know this history because we weren't from here. And so when we think about this book, this project that you first started, and what that meant for the revelation moment for you, for other young people, for people to understand that there was more to the story and more texture and more color. How, and I know you talk a little bit about it in the preface, but there's a piece that date resonated with you so much. And why was it so important to open the veil? I love what you said, Andy, just about the lens, the optometry, to see a different way of seeing this country's history.
Yeah, so Andy and I share our love for Langston Hughes, and the opening poem to the book is a Langston Hughes poem about 1619. 1619, so I was 15 or 16 years old when I first came across the date 1619, and it was in a book that Mr. Dow gave me to read outside of class. I became, when I got this one semester Black Studies course, I became so obsessed with learning the history that I would ask him to give me books to read on my own, because what I understood in this course was there's all this history that could be learned and people have decided not to teach it to us.
Right.
And I remember being a kid and being shocked. And I write about this. I feel kind of embarrassed sometimes to admit it as an adult, that as a child, I was shocked that there was so much history that could be learned. Because we all assume as kids that our teachers are teaching us what's most important to know. And so if you don't talk about Africa, Africans must not have done anything. If you don't talk about Black Americans in America, except for the fact that we appear during slavery, because you have to somewhat explain the Civil War, then we disappear for 100 years.
Right.
We come back with Dr. King giving one line from that speech about content of the character, and that's it. And there's no explanation as to why 100 years after the end of the Civil War, he has to march in the first place. Then you think that there was nothing else that we did that was worthy of note. And so taking that class and reading the date 1619 and realizing, wait, we've been here almost as long as the English, who get credit for all of this. And there was a ship before the Mayflower called the White Lion, and nobody ever mentioned that ship, but we all learn about the Mayflower, right? Like, that was transformative for me.
Yeah.
Because I realized at that moment, and I thank God that I was only 15 or 16, that there was a whole world of history that people had intentionally not taught us. So 16 connected me to a lineage that said our people have been here as long as almost anyone except Indigenous people. But it also helped me understand that I was going to have to educate myself because people were choosing to miseducate us.
Right.
And that miseducation is a part of how you maintain a racial hierarchy.
Right.
It works in service of that. This is why Carter G. Woodson creates Black History Week, Negro History Week. As he says, right, a people without a history, that is how you believe in your own inferiority, is believing that you have no history. So I've long obsessed about the year 1619 really stood in as both a lineage and about the power of erasure from the narrative. And I was determined to use that date to force a recentering of the American narrative that put slavery rightfully where it belonged, which is at the center of the American story. And that's that is what the 1619 project seeks to do, is a recentering, is to say we've all been taught this lens, but we need to widen that lens out.
Right.
Because you can't actually understand America through the lens of 1776. That
Right.
doesn't explain our country at all. It doesn't explain why there was an insurrection on January 6th.
Well,
It doesn't explain how we follow the first Black president with a white nationalist president. It doesn't explain George Floyd. It doesn't explain Ahmaud Arbery. Like, all of that is explained
right.
by 1619.
And it adds to a narrowness, right? The 1776 story and narrative is so narrow, and it doesn't add the color and the vibrancy of who we are as people, who we are collectively as history makers and present and future. And so being able to add to this experience and really, like you said, tell a story that I don't think it's just you that had the revelation moment. And I think especially in what we are seeing in light of this project, in light of this book, in light of being able to now have additional generations, we hear it. I worked for a university and we hear it on the university campus a lot. I didn't know this. And that is a confrontation. I think a lot of adults are confronted right now with what we didn't know and the truth that's being elevated and amplified through the work that you're doing and the work that has been done by the collective overall.
I mean, what I think is important in that is that the not knowing is intentional.
Right.
And we need to understand that this collective narrative of American exceptionalism is used to justify power.
Right.
And so when I started studying this, and I'm sure there's people in this room who had this experience, I became incorrigible as a student, because all of a sudden I began to question everything. And you couldn't just tell me something and erase us from the story anymore. I began to challenge my teachers. I began to challenge my understanding of the world. And then you understand why Black people were the only people in the history of America for whom it was ever illegal to read and write.
Right.
Because controlling your understanding of the world is how you control the body.
Right.
It's how you stop people from revolting and from fighting back. And that tool is still being used on our people right now.
Yes.
And this is why a work of journalism can be so dangerous. Because when people, you talked about, like some bifocal lenses, but I see the 1619 Project as the red pill in the matrix. That
Wow.
You've been living in your world and you have no idea what constructed it.
Right.
You take this red pill and all of a sudden you can see all of the coding and you see all of this shit is created.
Right.
All of it. None of it's natural. The inequality is not natural. The hierarchy is not natural. The subjugation is not none of that is natural. And if you know that it's not natural, then you know it can be deconstructed.
Exactly.
And it's the deconstruction that power fears.
Yeah. I think there's also pieces that you're saying that I'm hearing too, is just even when you know that it's not natural, even as you said, like you began to question, it creates a space of wanting to, there's this, I'm going to say like righteous anger.
Yes.
And then this desire to buck against what we've been told, indoctrinated it for, to continue to question the history, the culture, the understanding that continues to be fed to us now that you have that understanding and knowledge. So getting into the project, it starts with, and I'm backing out from the mic. So I have my magazine here, but now you have this book, beautiful texture, and a more expanded piece. What are you most excited about that has been added to the project?
Yes, so I'm excited about many things. It's rare as a journalist that you get a chance to perfect a major work. So where there was valid criticism, we responded to it. And people who know me, I think, where's Joy? My girlfriend from graduate school knows, like my primary, I receive vengeance through studying. So when people came for the project, I just said, okay, I'm going to study more. I'm going to learn more. And I'm just going to strengthen my argument. So I think people will find every single essay that was in the original project has been expanded. It has been strengthened. The biggest controversy around the project was a paragraph or two about slavery and the American Revolution. So I've now expanded that to several pages. And my case is even stronger. And when you think about why of everything, the original project was 9 essays, many works of short fiction and poetry, original art, but there's only it's been summarized by a couple paragraphs about slavery and the American Revolution, because somehow we have been led to believe that a nation founded by the majority of founders who had the wealth and power to break off from the greatest and wealthiest empire in the world because of slavery, the slavery had nothing to do with it. That the fact that the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, the man who drafted the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the first president, were all Virginia enslavers was just incidental somehow. Right? And so you understand then how important it is, this American mythology of exceptionalism, and how inconvenient Black people are to that narrative.
Right.
Okay, we're going off on a tangent. Sorry, that's what I do. So what I'm most excited about are one, all of the expansions of the original essay. So if you read the original project, you will find something new and interesting and stronger arguments in all of the originals. And then the way we were able to expand the essays into areas we couldn't cover before. So you talk about your ancestry being from Haiti. In the original project, we don't really engage with the diaspora.
Right.
That was intentional because I feel like Black Americans are always called, to basically stand in for all of Black people in the world, as if we can't just have our own story and our own history. And I wanted to make sure that this project was about American descendants of slavery right here. But having done that, now I felt we had to be in communication with what was happening in the diaspora. And all of us learn about the French Revolution. None of us learn about the Haitian Revolution.
Come on.
Why is that? Well, because it's not convenient to the narrative of 1776 to talk about how the first people to abolish slavery were actually Black people, not Americans, not white people, and they overthrow their masters and become the first Black republic in a hemisphere of slave colonies.
Right.
So we're not taught to aspire to the ideals of the Haitian Revolution, which of course leads to the expansion of slavery in the United States, because as we're all taught about the Louisiana Purchase, we're not taught about the fact that the reason Napoleon had to get rid of the Louisiana territory for cheap was because Black people had bankrupted him in fighting the revolution. So all of these are choices. So there's a piece in there by Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow, that she co-wrote with her sister Leslie Anderson, who is a historian, about the Haitian Revolution and how that leads to this pathological fear of Black Americans, because contrary to how we're often taught this history, of course, Black people resisted.
Right.
No human being submits to slavery voluntarily.
Right.
And that fear that Black people in Virginia, where in many places they outnumbered white people, and in South Carolina and Georgia, were going to do to white people what white people had done to them, leads to the fear that we see that allows 3 white men to chase down a Black man and say his body was the weapon, right?
Come on.
That leads to that. So we have a piece on that. We have a piece about Indian removal and settler colonialism, which was a gaping hole in the original project. We didn't deal with that. I knew it was a hole, but I didn't quite know how to deal with it and it still be about African slavery. I think that's probably for the kind of casual, the person who kind of casually studies history will probably be one of the most shocking essays in the piece, because not only does it talk about how Indian removal leads to the expansion of slavery, because of course you have to steal the land before you can expand slavery on it, but also that part of the civilization process for the 5 civilized tribes was that they also engaged in chattel slavery of African people, and that they held Black people in slavery. My dad's hometown is Greenwood, Mississippi in LaFleur County, and Greenwood LaFleur was a Choctaw Indian chief who was one of the biggest enslavers of Black people in Mississippi. And Black people were marched on the Trail of Tears, but you don't ever hear about that. And when we talk about Tulsa and the fact that the Black population in Tulsa was so wealthy, it was because the tribes that enslaved Black people, including the Cherokee, were forced by the federal government to pay them reparations. And so they were the only Black people in the history of America to receive reparations, and they received them from the indigenous tribes, and that set them up to be wealthy and found Black Wall Street. See why I love history? History's amazing, right? And so when you learn all of these things, you're like, damn, how could I not know this?
Right.
This is why when people saw Watchmen, they thought it was fictional. Because you don't believe that all of these things could have happened and you never heard of them. So I'm excited about all the expansion essays. And then a major part of this project that doesn't get talked about enough is all of the short fiction and poetry that's in the project. When I say the greatest living American writers, period, not Black writers, American writers are in this. It's called a literary timeline. So starting with 1619 and the landing of the White Lion, all the way till Mama Sonia Sanchez is the very last poet in the book. She's 87 years old. She's still out here fighting for our folks.
Amazing.
That all throughout, I mean, people from Terry McMillan, who I grew up reading her as a novelist, to Barry Jenkins, who of course is the Academy Award winning filmmaker. There's poetry and fiction throughout the book. And then the final thing is the photography. Every essay begins with an archival photo of just a regular Black person. No one famous, no one that we should know about, just Black people through time. And it's a way to kind of force all of us to collectively pause before we start each essay, before we read about the barbarism, the horrors, the torture, the terror, and the resilience and the fighting back, that you have to stop and remember everything we write about happened to real people.
Right.
And only with Black people do you have to remind people that these were human beings who loved, who cried, who hurt,
who were creative,
who had ambition, who had dreams, all of that. Everything that you have in humanity, Black people had, but we forget that.
Right.
And that's what slavery did with it. It tried to shave that humanity. So we begin each essay with a photo of a regular Black person. So that's what I love about the book. And it's a beautifully designed book. And I think of it as a testament and a testimony.
It's good. Preaching already. It's Sunday though. So
What's this bourbon? Hold on.
I am excited.
I'm taking bourbon collections, anybody? Just kidding, Andy, just kidding.
I'm excited to continue to dig into the Haitian Revolution. There are certain things that we understand in community, and those are the stories that my family told. But like you said, it's the story that is often, it's known, but not understood and not known. And I think, again, the links that you're talking about, if you are hearing the stories that are happening about the Haitian migration, the things that are happening historically within this country and the policies that we've made about Haiti, you can start with a root of why and continue to work your way forward. And so I think that it helps to shape and reshape the narrative that continues to be told about IET and what we will hope to continue to steward as the generations and the descendants of the Pearl of the Antilles. So I appreciate it. I think that that's something that a lot of Black people need to hear more about and understand, and not have it just be folklore. So thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, I know I'm just going all off the script, whatever the script is, but think about, I think I start with the preface of me as a child, because I think about how much your worldview and your perception of yourself is shaped by what you understand about your place in the world as a child. And I spent my childhood just desperately searching for myself in the story, for some belief that we had done something worthy of note. And the fact that they never teach you about Haiti and what it would mean as a child to know, damn, Black people fought back and won. But then that's why they don't teach you about Haiti.
Exactly.
And then what do we learn about Haiti? What do you hear again and again? Poorest country in the Western Hemisphere.
But
eating
why?
dirt cookies, corrupt. You think about all that. But Haitians had to pay back their enslavers reparations.
Come on. And it can't be done, right? In this country, we can't pay back reparations.
We can force the people who were enslaved to pay for their freedom. But we can't force the enslavers to pay for their enslaving.
Come on.
So you think how differently your perception of the world would have been had you learned, and I'm not saying don't teach the French Revolution, but why don't you teach the Haitian Revolution as well? And that we know Haiti has been treated the way it has because they had the audacity to be free.
Come on.
We know that because it gave life to the whole system. I hear all the time, People are like, yes, we engaged in slavery, but we were the first people to end slavery. We weren't. We weren't the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. We were third to the last. The Haitians were the first, Black Haitians. Everyone ended slavery in the Americas before us except Cuba and Brazil. So how do we all come to believe a collective lie? And who are those lies in service to? And how does it reorient your understanding of America? You know how, as Americans, we believe in our utmost exceptionalism. We are indoctrinated into this.
Yeah.
About everything except slavery. Then we're like, everybody was doing it. All of a sudden, it's okay not to be exceptional when it comes to the most barbarous system ever created by humanity. Then we're just like everyone else. And then if you point to, well, actually, a lot of people knew slavery was wrong,
right,
including the people who were enslaved.
Right.
Then it turns that narrative on its head. And there is a power in that, because once you teach our children that, you can't tell them just anything about themselves and their people.
Right.
And that is, that's the reason there was a slave Bible and a regular Bible. Because to keep people oppressed, you have to erase. You have to erase so much of the history of their fighting.
And so much of what they could actually believe in and aspire towards. Or
that we were actors.
Right.
In the story.
Right.
Like we weren't just sitting there waiting for white folks to figure out what they were going to do.
Right.
But that's how we're taught this history. And then we have to credit them. We have to be thankful to them for doing what they should have done in the first place. And what we forced them to do. So anyway, sorry.
I appreciate it.
I feel slightly passionate about this.
In the first chapter of Democracy, you speak about Reconstruction. So also thinking about the things that we choose not to speak about, and especially in light of this year and centering Tulsa and centering all of these other massacres that have happened across this country. According to a report that our Zen Education Project, which is coordinated with Rethinking Schools, we're releasing a report in January. Reconstruction is another era that is left out of or misrepresented in textbooks. So why do you think that Reconstruction has been systematically erased in textbooks or written off as a failure?
Because it serves the narrative of white supremacy. The first time I learned about Reconstruction that I can remember was in Black Studies in college, where I took, AFAM Survey 101, and we had to read Eric Foner. And Eric Foner, who I think is, probably the greatest, if not one of the greatest, if not the greatest living American historian, single-handedly kind of resurrected the period of Reconstruction from the kind of ash bins of history. And the reason why we don't learn about Reconstruction, or if we do, we learn that it was a failed experiment in multiracial democracy, is because Reconstruction condemns us. Because if you learn about Reconstruction, then you see we didn't have to become the country that we became for 100 years. That we had this brief period at the end of slavery where we actually believed in multiracial democracy, where Black people began to govern, where Black people in the South bring public education to the South. They bring progressive taxation, that they began to really create this progressive democracy that we believe that we were. And then we see America go back to its natural form. And the natural form is we are a nation founded on white supremacy and racism, and a belief that democracy is for white people, and that we, Black people, were never supposed to be part of the body politic. We weren't part of the we the people. We weren't even citizens in the country of our birth until the 14th Amendment. So we have to erase that history, because how do we justify the 100 years of racial apartheid that follows? How do we show that it was a choice, that we didn't have to do that? And that's so much of what the 1619 Project is trying to do. We didn't invent the scholarship. The scholarship has been around for 50, 60 years.
Right.
There have been historians who have been writing these texts, who have been reorienting our understanding of American history, but it hadn't permeated to the popular audience in the way that this project has. When you study Reconstruction, I mean, it's one of the most compelling parts of American history, because you see what we could have been.
Yeah.
You see a nation that could have atoned for slavery, that could have said, out of the ashes of the Civil War, you know, a country that has both tried to diminish the role of slavery, but also was nearly destroyed by slavery, that we could have become the country that we believe that we were in the Declaration, and we made a choice not to be that country. And Black people had to go, as W. Du Bois said, back under the veil for 100 years, until a decade before I was born. I don't know how old you are. I'm not going to age you like I'm going to age myself. But I think that that is important to remember. Like, my dad was born in apartheid Mississippi. Until 10 years before I was born, it was legal to discriminate against the descendants of slavery in every aspect of American life, in housing, education, employment, whether you could go to a public pool or not, whether you could use a library, whether you could go to a public park. It was all legal until a decade before I was born.
Right.
So when we want to say that was a long time ago,
Yeah.
it wasn't.
Right.
There's probably people in this room
The generational.
who were born into that
Yeah.
country. It wasn't a long time ago, and there's never been an effort to repair what was done, which is why Black people and Indigenous people, the two people who didn't choose to be a part of this country, suffer the worst from everything except osteoporosis. That's the one thing I found. I'm obsessed, right? So I was like, there's got to be one thing that white people have worse than us. And I have found it, and it's osteoporosis. That's all I know. We had to have strong backs, apparently, to survive this country. It's the one thing. Anyway.
I think there's so much about the like intergenerational history that continues to be told, especially thinking about like from a corporate standpoint. We understand that there are multiple generations in the workplace. So if you add that to multiple generations that live in this country, that live with a narrative, that live with a history, a lived experience, and seeing those threads continue to be, as you said, erased, but then as we know, not even like acknowledged in many ways, and that we say that it's so far ago. I remember having a conversation recently with somebody who made the reminder that like these photos that we see of MLK on the March on Washington were done intentionally not to be in color. So we wouldn't have that memory, that we wouldn't have that understanding that it's not that far ago. And so I think those are pieces of how do we continue to tell that time span, that time frame is short, and there's not a lot of distance between those things.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. At the time that he was assassinated, the majority of white Americans reviled him. They didn't support him. They were opposed to him. They called him all the names they call Black people who fight for freedom, a communist, a charlatan. This was 1968. I was born 8 years later. So, I'm not young, but I'm not old. That timing, right? That the framework of that timing is important, because as I write in the final essay of the book, which is called Justice, is for 250 years, we practiced chattel slavery in this country. We followed that by 100 years of racial apartheid. Jim Crow is a euphemism. We need to stop using it. We had a society that ordered everything about Black life. It didn't matter your education. It didn't matter what your position, your profession. You were going to be assigned a place in our society, and there were things you could or could not do based on your race. I talk about how my mother is white, my father is Black. My father's mother was born in 1924 in Greenwood, Mississippi. My mother's father was born in 1924, a white man in Iowa, the grandchild of European immigrants who could come here and have every right that Black people didn't have, who had been here for generations. That they were born into literally two societies.
Right.
My grandmother had to deliver my father in a shack on a cotton plantation because Black people couldn't deliver in the hospital. She couldn't use a public library. She couldn't go she had to quit school with the 5th grade because she had to work in the field. And my grandfather was born into a society where if he had the money, he could do anything. He could live in any neighborhood. He could go to any school. He could work any job. And then we want to pretend that somehow has nothing to do with the society that we're in.
Right, now. Right.
that it just is erased. That in 1968, when we finally passed the last of the great civil rights law, by the way, after 40 years of bloody struggle,
Right.
where children were being bombed, where people were being assassinated, that when our country grudgingly in 1968 finally said, okay, we're finally not going to legally treat Black people different, that the debt was paid, that everything just disappeared. And it didn't. So the same way that we think the Declaration still matters or the Constitution still matters, even though that document was signed a long time ago, how can we argue that something that pre-exists our nation, slavery, by 150 years is somehow irrelevant to the
Right.
society that we built? It's not logical.
Right. And that people would be able to as easily, I think the collective, Bell Hooks talks about the collective memory of the trauma of slaves and that experience that continues generationally, but then to think that we would just move forward and forget that those memories happened or those experiences happened.
But it's not just the forgetting, it's the material impact.
Right.
Right? Like slavery was not a racist system, it was an economic system.
Right.
Racism is what justified
Right.
the economic exploitation of Black bodies. So you have a people who for 250 years could earn no income, acquire no wealth, acquire no property. Then we follow that up by 100 years of legal apartheid that kept Black people out of labor union jobs, professional jobs. In the South, you couldn't even get a professional degree because there were no colleges that allowed you in, even
Right.
though you pay tax dollars. So when we look at the fact that Black wealth is $1 for every $10 of white wealth, that if you're a Black family with children, you have 1 cent for every $1 that white wealth has. That is a legacy of slavery and apartheid. And we just said, okay, now you all have the same rights, but we didn't repair anything.
Right.
And what we told Black folks is, now that we cannot discriminate against you explicitly by race, now we have to pretend race doesn't exist.
Right.
When it comes to fixing the problem, now race doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And that's the society that we're in right now. And this is why, this fake critical race theory propaganda campaign, which simply argues, why is it that 55 years after the civil rights movement, why are Black people still on the bottom of society? Well, that's because we have a society where the racism is structural. You don't even have to be personally racist for it to replicate.
Right.
And people want that replication because it maintains power.
Right. You're leaning right into some of my next questions.
That's fine. You only have to ever have 3 questions when you interview me because I'll just talk.
I'll just read my notes beforehand. No, I mean, this is great. So just thinking about this as we're talking about what we currently understand about anti-history education, also so-called anti-CRT, the right wing is hollering that everybody is learning about the 1619 Project, but the reality is,
that's right,
it's a small but growing, number of teachers who are introducing this content. So what do you think would change about our country if everybody was raised learning the truth about U.S. history?
I think white elite power would lose its justification for exercising that power. I mean, that's really what this is about, is the narrative justifies the power. So if the narrative is, we have all this money, we run everything because we are the best equipped to run it, we deserve it, we're the only people who've built this country, we're the only people who've done anything worthy in science and math and all, right? That's what justifies why a small minority, and it is a minority of the country, there's a reason white conservatives are passing all of these laws to stop people from voting, right? There's a reason why they're gerrymandering, why they're ensuring that even with a minority of voters, they can maintain power in states all across this country. There's a reason they're doing that. So if we're taught a different history, then we expect a different country. We're not taught the history of the country that exists. We're taught the history of the country they want to pretend that we are.
Right.
And what keeps working people whose class interests should tell us that we should be together apart? And it's because race is the oldest wedge issue in America.
Yep.
People always say, low-income white people, working class white people who vote for Republicans are voting against their own interest. That's true if you don't know the primary interest in America is whiteness. That's worth more than any dollars that you can have.
Right.
So we're taught the history that justifies the society that we live in. And the history of 1619 does not justify the society that we live in. And that's what's scary. I've spent a lot of time recently trying to understand this. Where did this anti-CRT campaign come from? Why are we all talking about critical race theory when a year ago only history nerds and scholars knew what critical race theory was? And it's very clear that it's a reaction to the reckoning, the very short-lived, fleeting reckoning of last year, where you saw an astounding 1 out of 10 Americans said they participated in a Black Lives Matter protest last year. This was multi-generational, multiracial. And I saw a poll that said 45% of Republicans said that structural racism was a primary obstacle for Black Americans. That's unheard of. Nearly half of Republicans who really are about blaming Black people for their own disadvantage, right? For saying we're all free, we're all equal. If Black people suffer, it's because Black people choose not to live up to their opportunities. And so to see half of them saying, damn, there's something bigger at work here, that had to require a response, because narrative drives policy, right? Policy comes from us understanding a certain narrative that says, oh, maybe I should vote for universal health care.
Right.
Maybe reparations is important. Maybe we should allow a woman to stay at home from work when she's had a baby and not have to go back to work when the baby's 6 weeks old.
Right.
That drives policy. And so the people who have benefited from a country that is exceptional in all the wrong ways. Let's be clear. We are an exceptional nation. We're exceptional in that we incarcerate more of our citizens than any country in the world.
Come on.
We're exceptional in that we're the most unequal of the Western democracies. That of the Western democracies and some that aren't democracies like Cuba, we're the only country where whether you have health care or not depends on if you have a job. We have the stingiest social safety net of all the Western democracies. So all the countries that we like to compare ourselves to, we are exceptional, but not in ways that we should be proud of.
Right.
So if you study the history of 1619, you understand that country. If you study the history of 1776, then you can ignore all of that and just say we're a great country.
Right.
So that's the response. Is voters went, they turned away a white nationalist president with the highest margin of victory in the history of presidential elections. They turned the Senate, sending the first Black man to Congress as a senator from Georgia since Reconstruction.
Come on.
And then the folks were like, oh no, this cannot stand, right?
Yeah.
So what do? We tell white people, well, look, they're tearing down your monuments. They want you to feel bad. They're telling your children that your children are evil.
Right.
You can't have a coalition with those people because those people don't think that you have a right to be proud of who you are.
Right.
And that shit has been effective since Bacon's Rebellion.
Come on.
Right? It just has.
Yeah.
So it was predictable. It was predictable. And I think that is why people don't want us to learn that history, because I can't tell you how many white Americans I've talked to. I believe there's a certain segment of white society that doesn't care. They just don't. Whatever the facts are, they don't care. They don't want to know. But I don't think that's most white Americans. I think most white Americans have suffered from the same poor history that we've all been taught. And if you can help them to see the truth, they will do things differently.
Right.
And that's the fear.
Right.
It's those white Americans who will read the 1619 Project or similar texts and say, you know what? This isn't the country I thought it was. So I'm going to make decisions to build the country that I believe it should be. And that's the fear.
And it's always about the small minority afraid of losing the power that the big majority would be able to overturn.
Because the majority, Republicans have not won a presidential election by popular vote, I think, but one time in the last 25 years. They've won through the Electoral College, which is also a legacy of slavery, right? When Barack Obama becomes the first Black president with a white minority, white people took credit for it, but I'm like, most of y'all did not vote for him. But it was because of record turnout among Black Americans, Latinos, Asian American, Indigenous Americans, and then a plurality of white Americans. And what that showed was you didn't need most white Americans to vote a certain
Right.
way to get change. And that was very frightening to people,
Right.
especially in a country where the demographics are shifting.
Yeah.
So I would never say we are in the period of redemption. We'll never go all the way back to where we were, but we are in a very frightening period, because one thing the history tells us is white Americans are not, a group of white Americans are not going to give up their power willingly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of people on the front lines who are, the book is being banned, the project is being banned. Our work at Teaching for Change, our work as an education project is also written in the legislation that is happening from the right wing. So about 28 states have laws on the books or are starting to continue to ramp up. And we know 2022 and 2024 are not that far away. So thinking about those frontline people, what do you think about educators who are fighting back against the anti-history education movement? And what can non-teachers do to support them and defend them?
One, I feel tremendous gratitude and pride in all of the educators who are resisting, who are having a great deal of courage right now. We need more courage and they need more support, because the opposition is extremely organized. When you see all of those videos of people going to school board meetings, you're not seeing the counter organizing.
Right.
You're not seeing the large group of people who are saying, teach our children the truth. We defend our educators showing up. And so it is a scary place to be an educator right now.
Yep.
Because you don't know that if you do the right thing, will your community have your back?
Exactly.
If you're on the school board and you stand up to these people, will your community have your back?
Right.
The time for sitting idly on the sidelines is over. There are more than 150 scholars of authoritarianism and democracy who have signed letters saying our democracy is on the brink right now. And I don't think we have the urgency.
Yeah.
And let me tell you something, Black folks can't save this country by ourselves.
Come on. Come on.
This is the expectation every 4 years for Black people to overcome every obstacle that's put up, every obstacle. And then we say, y'all are amazing. Thank you. Thank you once again. And then you dismiss Black people's concerns.
Right.
And you say, you know what, if we talk about race so much, we're going to turn off our white voters.
Right.
We aren't going to be able to overcome every obstacle. We have seen in state legislatures the largest wave of anti-voting laws we've seen since before the 1965 Voting Rights Act. You can't out-organize that.
Right.
So I think we have to decide, are we willing, to fight for the country that we say that we are? Because again, the opposition is organized. They're passing laws, they're protesting, they're getting a lot of news coverage. Even media, who we would think would be allies to democracy, are falling victim to the propaganda as well. So I just hope, we have to do more than sit in rooms and clap our hands. Let me say that. There's work to do, and we're not doing it. You can clap your hands though to that.
And I think there's the pieces. So in the book, there's also the chapter on capitalism. And so also seeing where that funding, the financial experience continues to be perpetuated in what we are seeing in right-wing acting. So it's not just the resourcing to equip the narrative, but then there's also the financial backing to attack educators, to be able to display names of educators in the city and the school district that they teach in. And so thinking about that concerted effort in that same vein. And so when you talk about the movement, when you talk about it has to be more than just clapping and sitting in a room, with the backdrop of the murder of George Floyd and the revelations of Ahmaud and Breonna, we saw this rebellion. Many people were hopeful that this would change things in other ways movements have not. How do you remain hopeful in the midst of all of this?
Andy already knows the answer to that.
I heard him laugh.
I'm not hopeful.
Okay.
I think hope is a balm, because hope makes us feel like, I know things will get better. Hope has to be an action. If we're not actively working to make it better, it will not on its own. Much respect to Dr. King, but the arc of the universe, I don't believe it bends towards justice. we bend it or we don't.
Mm.
But there's no inherent progress. So I just, last year briefly did feel different as someone who has studied history. It felt like we were on the brink of something. And then all of a sudden, all of our allies realized, well, damn, this shit's kind of hard. And you can't turn a 400-year system in 2 months of protest.
Right.
And certainly not by turning your square black on Instagram.
Come
like
on.
there's real work to be done. And I think too many were just really willing to walk away really fast when things didn't change. I mean, what has come out of that?
Yeah.
No policing reform bill. That was the easiest thing.
Right.
The easiest thing is to say you can't kill a citizen in the street and not face a consequence.
Right,
That's the easiest thing.
Right.
We couldn't do that.
Right.
What
But
else
they gave
have we
us
accomplished?
Juneteenth, right? Juneteenth became a national holiday, y'all, but we
got
can't teach
Juneteenth.
about it in Texas or other places.
Right, but you can't teach the text that explain why Juneteenth had to happen in Texas, where the 1619 Project is banned by name, and instead they passed a bill called the 1836 Project,
Right.
which is the year that white Texans, broke off from Mexico to found a slaveholding republic because Mexico had banned slavery. So I just, it's hard to feel. I don't believe in hope for me in general. I believe other people should have hope and execute on that hope. For me, that's never been a motivation because people will let you down.
Yeah.
Right? Like, why 400 years after the first landing are we still having to fight for basic rights of citizenship? And then be grateful that I'm not a slave. Like,
Right.
The backlash that we're seeing is in response to even a semblance of resistance,
Yeah.
right? The intensity of the backlash that we're seeing, these laws, the gerrymandering, Congress people who will openly call, share things about murdering other Congress people of color.
Right.
We're in a dangerous period. I would just suggest people really study the period of redemption and see what happened, because I don't know. We've only had a resemblance of a democracy for less than 60 years. And we're told all the time, this is the oldest continuing democracy in the world. That's a lie. We had democracy since 1965, a semblance of it. And for the vast history of our country, the idea of democracy was predicated on excluding Black people. And that's how white people could join hands across political party. They could find common ground because we were completely excluded. And we have been fighting to maintain democracy ever since then. And we are at a point where we may lose it again. And we're all just sitting here. We're all just sitting here. What are y'all doing? I did my part. I'm a journalist. Now y'all have to act. What are y'all gonna do? What are y'all gonna do? I'm not playing. What are y'all gonna do? I mean, we have to get more organized. I mentioned this at the beginning. I just was at a talk in Philadelphia. Mama Sonia Sanchez read. This woman is 87 years old. And in the green room, she says, we have to start organizing. What are we going to do? And I'm like, this woman is 87 years old.
Right.
She's been fighting her whole life. And she's telling us, like, I'm still going to fight for you.
Right.
But we have to fight for ourselves.
Yeah.
This is not a game right now.
Yeah.
I'm deeply afraid of what's happening in our country. Does
the project give a sense of equipping for those to be battle ready?
I think I'm gonna, Timothy Snyder, who's a historian and studies authoritarianism, what he said is, I know it's exhausting, right? There's so many fronts to be fighting on. The same states that are barring the 1619 Project and critical race theory are passing anti-voting laws.
Right.
They're passing laws against women's reproductive rights. We know that there's a major case going before the Supreme Court right now, and it can be exhausting because I almost feel like you get debilitated because you feel there's so many fronts to be fighting on. And what Timothy Snyder says is that we all have to pick an institution and defend it. So you can't fight every fight. What's the thing that you value most or that you are most worried about? Pick that institution and defend it. We all have to choose our weapons right now, whatever those weapons may be. Not literal weapons, Fox News, not real weapons.
We're not starting riots. Here.
Metaphorical weapons. Mine is the pen, right? But we all have to choose our weapons. And I think part of the strategy is chaos. It's to wear you down.
Right.
It's to make you feel you don't have any control over it, that it's all a done deal. But it's not. We choose the society that we have. And we actually are the majority. We are the majority. But like Democrats, we don't exercise the power of majority. But we have it.
Yeah. Stepping into the confidence of what we do have. We are going to open up the floor. So I'd like for you all to be thinking about the questions that you have, and Lori is going to come by with a mic. So I see some of these hands raised. And so one thing to keep in mind, please have a question.
We all say that all you want. It never works out that way.
We all love Nikole. We know she's
I'm going to get
great.
to my question in a second. That's what they're going to do. I'm telling you. It's okay.
We know she's great and beautiful and lovely. But questions, folks, please. And now we're making our way downtown, walking fast. Here we go.
Oh, wow, the first one. Thank you. Come Freeman, Angry Black Man in Therapy, We Act Radio. Thank you, Shalal, for making this place available. Please give him a round of applause. This is not to be taken lightly. He said he wanted to give a place there. These quiet meetings in the basements were put on Front Street, and I think he's done that. All right. I love redheads. Just want to say that. And you a badass.
I'm a natural redhead too.
Yeah. Oh. Can we give the natural redhead badass a round of applause? My question is this.
Hold on. For real? That's all I get? That was
whack. That was whack. I wasn't gonna say it, but thank you.
I thought y'all came here to see me.
You know what I'm saying?
No love.
Thank you for correcting the record there. My question is, I don't know if you've been paying attention to the license plates here in Washington, D.C. The last plantation, us in Puerto Rico. It says taxation without representation. And as the record of their story dictates, the American Revolution was fought over taxation without representation. So having said that, you said, what are we going to do? Would you support, not that you would do, but would you support a tax resistance if people wanted to put their money where their mouth is and stop funding the system of their demise as diametrically opposed to their existence, and support tax resistance? That's my question.
So, I don't know exactly what that looks like, and I don't like to speak about things that I haven't studied. What I will say is I support resistance. So whatever that resistance looks like, whatever is considered the best form of resistance for that, then I support it. But tax resistance, maybe. Tell me more. That just means people stop paying taxes?
Real quick, Johnny Cochran said the best way to, for those who do not know, the young boys and girls, Johnny Cochran was a freedom fighter, lawyer, attorney, famous for the O.J. Simpson case, but he claimed his biggest case was that of Geronimo Pratt, who was a Black Panther who was railroaded by the FBI and spent 27 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit, and the FBI set it up and knew that, and Johnny Cochran got him free and gave him, he was awarded $4 million, and he passed away in Tanzania. Just for the boys and girls who do not know.
Can I just say, if I could answer like that, you could have got through a lot more questions.
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure. But Johnny Cochran said the best way to air your grievances against the federal government is withholding income taxes. And Kimon Freeman, Kimon Tecumseh Freeman, Brooklyn Art Space, 239-04-7266 has been a tax resistant for 25 years. It's possible.
I don't know about you, Nikole, but I'm scared of the IRS.
I'm not gonna lie, I pay all my taxes. If anybody's listening.
Good evening. Thank you for bringing us to this space today. I'm Brittany from Natchez, Mississippi. Mississippi represent, Natchez represent. Recently you visited Greenwood, and it's never lost on me the many powerful Mississippi influences you've tapped into, from Ida B. Wells and Fannie Lou Hamer to including Kiesi Layman and Jasmine Ward in the book. Nerves. It's a three-part question. What was that trip to Mississippi like for you? Will there be 1619 Projects Part 2 that highlight more Black contributions to history? And how can we host you in Natchez?
So I'm gonna have you repeat the second question because I didn't quite get it. So Greenwood is what I consider my ancestral land. That's where our people are from. That's where, I mean, Deshaun can attest to this. Almost every Black person in my hometown is from Mississippi. Same migration that brought Black folks on the Illinois Central line to Chicago, but apparently our folks were just too country and got off the train too early. Didn't realize the big city was a couple stops up. So Mississippi flavored everything about our community, our culture, our worship, our music, our cuisine. So, but it was also a place my dad never took us to. The first time I visited Mississippi, I was in my 30s. I went down there to report on Freedom Summer. Greenwood was ground zero for Freedom Summer. Mississippi was the most apartheid state in America. It lynched more Black people than any state in the country. And Greenwood lynched more Black people than any county in the lynching state in the country. It was a hard place to be Black. There's a reason that that's where the blues were invented. But going home, which I call it home, is just emotionally draining. I stood in the field where my father was born, and at the cemetery where our family is buried, where most of the Black people don't even have a headstone. You just walk over graves because they're so poor, they couldn't even afford to mark the graves of their loved ones. And this is 2021. And you just realize so much about America when you go to Mississippi, because it's also a place where I met with Black activists, particularly Black women activists, who are still working to democratize Mississippi and democratize the country. It's a place, I think, that explains how the failures of the civil rights movement is that you can have Black political power, but if you don't have Black economic power, you're still not free. Black people Mississippi has more elected Black officials than any place in the country, and it has the most impoverished Black population of any place in the country. So I feel conflicted about it. I think as any child of immigrants, because in some ways that's what we are, our families who migrated. If you read my all-time favorite book, which is The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, she posits our story in the story of every immigrant who came here looking for a better life, except we were fleeing our own country looking for a better life. But I also think it's a place, I think it is the compass for America. How good we're doing as a country depends on how bad Mississippi is doing, which means we're fucked. What was your second question?
My second question was, would there be like a 1618 part 2 where we, or where you, not we as a me, but where you kind of highlight all the contributions of this Black Americans in the historical history?
You mean outside of the book? Because, you know, the books, it took me 2 years to do that. And I definitely have a lot more gray hairs. I just dye them so you can't see them. I think an important part of the expansion was really resistance and resilience. That as we expanded into new chapters, it was so important to center that so that people don't walk away feeling that this is just a project about what white people did to us. That it's also a project about what we gave and how we fought and how we are the primary democratizing force in this country. So I think you'll find in the book, both through the poetry and short fiction and the essays, a lot more of that story of Black empowerment, resilience, and resistance, which is really the primary story of Black America, right? The founding fathers didn't believe in those words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. But Black people did. And that's been our enduring struggle. And I really think that's what makes people so angry about this project. It's not a project about a beating down people.
Right.
It's a project about a people who said, you don't believe that shit, but we do.
Come on.
And your third question, no more 3-part questions, y'all. but personal privilege because you're from Mississippi. Oh, Natchez. So I'm hoping that we can do a southern leg of the 1619 tour starting next year. COVID, it's the types of COVID restrictions you can enact down south are just different. There's laws that don't even allow you to force people to mask. Vaccine rates are very low, so I'm not trying to kill myself out here on this tour. So I hope that we can go to Mississippi because that's also my ancestral land, and I hope we can go to all kinds of places in the South because that is our ancestral land. One of the arguments that I really hope people will take from the opening essay of the book is we love to treat the South like it's some backwards part of America, as if the heart of America is really the free North, which wasn't free, by the way. All 13 colonies practiced slavery.
Right.
The largest slave-holding colony right before the Revolution was actually New York. There's a reason there's a whole burial ground, African burial ground in New York. But the spiritual center of America is really the South. Not just for Black people, but for white people too. The Virginians are the ones who wrote our founding documents. The Virginians were the majority of our first presidents. We paid off our Revolutionary War debts with tobacco grown by enslaved people in Virginia. The idea of republicanism was really, American-style republicanism was really solidified in Virginia. So we have to stop. It's a convenient narrative to say that the South is different and not really representative of America, but it is. And that's also because that's the heart of Black America. So I don't know about Natchez. I assume if we go down there, how far is Natchez from Jackson or Greenwood? Yes.
And Natchez is also for the state of Mississippi, a relatively progressive city in the state. So it's going to be a different experience for you than in Greenwood.
Now, Greenwood would be, probably not going to do it in Greenwood. Maybe Jackson. Yeah, so I definitely, I hope to come to Mississippi. We're going to come to the South. And one of the things that was important to me, I mean, this is why we went to Waterloo, was so often these book tours to skip so many places where Black folks are because they're not the big cities, which we are in the big cities too. But I know from my own family, we want this type of information.
Right.
We want to engage, but we just get skipped over and ignored. And so I'm trying to be very careful not to do that, even though I've been in DC more than once, but I'm just saying.
Hi, I'm Taylor. I'm from a few blocks away. And my question is, you spoke about the fallacy of the belief that poorer white people vote against their interests because whiteness is really the biggest motivating factor for white voters. And I'm a big believer in the monumentalness of the Bacon's Rebellion, but I didn't learn about it until college. In fact, I believe, and I argued in my thesis, that race was constructed in America to stymie the interracial class coalitions during the Bacon's Rebellion. So what would America look like if poor white people did vote in line with their class rather than their race?
So one, I think if I look at the data, most poor white people actually do vote Democrat. It's a small margin, but working class white people actually do vote Democrat. So again, how do we all come to understand the collective narrative that's not true? And whose interest does that serve? Mm-hmm. But the reason, I agree. I think race, we can trace the history. When I tell you I study history because history calms me, because history explains what otherwise doesn't make sense in the world. And when you look at Bacon's Rebellion, you had indentured white people who also were unfree. They weren't enslaved, but they were unfree. Indentured Black people, and you had enslaved Black people who rose up against the white elite. And the response by the white elites, who are outnumbered, is to say, okay, we're going to create slave codes. And the slave codes denote every Black person, no matter what, as below every white person, no matter what. So white people can make contracts, Black people can't. White people can get married, Black people can't. White people can serve on juries, even if they're poor, Black people can't. And so it creates this divide. And if you are a poor white person who has nothing, no land, no property, you're poor. But what I'm not is I'm not a slave, and a slave is Black. And that becomes very powerful. So we see it now. I remember around the time of when Trump was running, and the New York Times was running the 10 million story about white Trump voters. Don't get me fired now. Along with everyone else. I mean, the New York Times is not unusual in that. And they were talking to white folks who were benefiting from all these social programs. Like they were getting unemployment, they were getting Medicaid, they were getting all this shit. And they were like, we hate government programs. They were opposed to the programs that were helping them because in their mind, those programs were for Black people. And if they depended on them, then they were like a Black person. And the data, the polling on this is very clear that white support for social programs declines if they think Black people are benefiting from them. So look at who didn't expand healthcare for people in this country. It was all the South. Millions of poor white people in the South. Millions. More poor white people than poor Black people. But there was a willingness to hurt yourself if it will hurt more Black people. And we see that again and again. So why don't we learn the lessons of Bacon Rebellion? Because that challenges power. We're all, now suffering is not equal. Poor white people don't suffer like poor Black people. Suffering is still racialized in this country. But if we understood that, who's really picking your pocket, it's not the poor Black person who's picking your pocket. It's not the poor Black person that puts you on a wage that you can't live off of. Right? Why you don't have dental care, why you don't have health care, why you don't have child care. It's not poor Black people, it's not poor brown people, it's not poor Indigenous people. But if you believe that it is, that's all that matters. And if you believe that if you have to depend on things like they do, then you become their low status, that's Bacon Rebellion. So that's why we're not taught about these histories. Again, when you understand the history, your thinking about policy gets transformed. And so whose benefit are these histories that we're taught? Not ours.
Another question. It's quick.
Oh, point of personal privilege. Somebody gonna get her? Okay, go ahead, sis.
So another completely different question, but do you think Lincoln's assassination was critical to Reconstruction failing, or do you think it was Andrew Johnson, other factors at play, or do you think Reconstruction would have been successful if Lincoln was alive or lived?
So I don't think that wise people try to predict what would have happened if X, Y, Z happened instead, because I don't think society works like that. Lincoln gets assassinated and Andrew Johnson, of course, comes in, but Reconstruction actually comes after Andrew Johnson is impeached, when the radical Republicans, through veto, override Andrew Johnson's, I mean, maybe 40 acres and a mule would have stayed in place. But it's not, I don't think, the fault of Andrew Johnson that Reconstruction failed, because Reconstruction is implemented over Andrew Johnson. Reconstruction fails because white people choose whiteness. And if you look at, David Blight, one of my favorite historians, has a book on Civil War and memory. And he really talks about how at that period, white people choose national unification. That the way to become reunified after the Civil War is we have to put Black people back in their natural place. And that's what they do. When they strike the deal to give Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency, it is the decision that the main obstacle to national unity is Black Americans. In a country built for white Americans, which Lincoln did believe in. His views were changing before he died, and it would be interesting to know how they would have continued to evolve had he lived. But I don't think we can blame the failures of Reconstruction on Lincoln's assassination. I think we blame the failures of Reconstruction on a country that could not imagine Black people as citizens.
Lori, I see you back there.
Whiteness is a hell of a thing, huh? And we've got one last question from the audience before we pivot over back to Keisha.
Hi, my name is Candace Norwood. Apologies for asking a very industry-specific question, but I'm a reporter with the 19th News. And so first of all, just wanted to say I'm excited for your partnership with our news organization, the Fellowship for HBCU graduates. Second of all, I'm about 5 years into my career, and during that time, I felt a lot of self-doubt, pushback when I've tried to pursue stories that I feel like try to, go towards reframing the narrative of how we talk about these important issues. For, I guess, a question you've probably been asked a million times, but any advice that you have for these people like myself who may not have the biggest platforms, who are trying to make change in whatever way we can with our stories? Yeah.
What's your name, sis?
Candace Norwood.
Candace, nice to meet you. Aaron Haynes is a very dear friend of mine. Before I answer that, I just want to briefly address the whiteness is a hell of a drug comment, because I think it's important to understand that when we say whiteness is a choice. It's not saying people who come from Europe should be ashamed of coming from Europe.
Right.
Whiteness is a construct that was created on this soil. There was no such thing as white. You were Irish, you were German, you were French, you were English, Protestant, Catholic, whatever. So I think when people hear that, and bad faith actors, and they want to say, you want white people to be ashamed of being white. Well, yes, because whiteness is about a construct of power and hierarchy. But it's not about being ashamed of who you are, where your people come from. Everyone has a right to be proud of their heritage, of where they come from. But whiteness was created to dominate. It was created to create a system of power and exploitation. And when James Baldwin says, for us to be free, white people have to give up whiteness, he's not talking about Europe. He's talking about some made up shit.
Right.
That has hurt a lot of people. And I don't want anyone to hear that and not really understand what's being argued or what's being said. So to your other question, I've talked a lot about, it's easy to see me where I am in my career and think it was somehow inevitable. It wasn't. I was also punished for wanting to write about Black folks, for wanting to write about racial inequality. A decade ago, I nearly left the industry. I struggled. I worked 2 jobs till I was 30 years old. I was working in a newspaper by day and getting off work and selling mattresses on the side, just to make ends meet. So what I'll say is, one, be encouraged. I'm like Master P. I was slinging mixtapes out my trunk for a long time before I made it here. And it was not guaranteed that I was going to make it here. But what was guaranteed was I was not going to sell myself out to make it here.
Come on.
I can't promise you that if you are true to why you got into this field, if you're true to the journalism that you think is important to do, I cannot promise you success. But what I can promise you is if that you compromise yourself to get there, you'll never enjoy that success the way that you should. So keep trying, get your allies, get your mentors, find people like Aaron, who is a believer like myself, that our job is to be the person for others that we needed when we were trying to make it. I know that's what she believes. Find your circle of folks and just keep pushing and understand you may or may not get there. But if you know what you're doing is right, then the struggle is always worthy. And that's all I can say to that.
So Nikole, the
Yes, ma'am.
last question that I have for you this evening is, what does joy in the resistance look like for you personally?
As hard as this work can be, I'm like happy every day to be blessed to do it. And that's just a fact. I don't feel a burden. I talk a lot about my grandmother, who had a 5th grade, I think she had a 4th grade education, who was born on a cotton plantation, who, when my dad was 2 years old, packed her suitcase and her cold bag of fried chicken that her mother had fried for them, and got on that train and was determined that her kids would not pick cotton in the South like she had. And she did that. And my father, who was never able to find his American dream, produced me. And my job is to tell their stories and to vindicate every dream they never had. So I take joy every day in the fact that I can tell these stories exactly like I think they should be told, that I'm banned in 10 states. And that's what I get my joy from, because you get into journalism to make powerful people uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And so I judge my success by how angry I'm making these folks right now. That's that. Oh, and I get joy from people who buy me bourbon, so.
Well, the book is The 1619 Project, A New Origin Story. If you have not picked it up or gotten it, you can grab it from the bookstore today. Do not leave home without it or here without it. This is home. I already said that earlier. And also, I think taking the charge. It's not just enough to buy the book, read the book, know the history, and keep telling the story. And let's get out there and do what we need to do to change what the future will look like.
Yes.
Nikole Hannah-Jones, thank you.
Thank you.
Busboys and Poets, thank you.
Y'all were amazing. Thank you. Thank you. That's it. Somebody should pull the curtain.
Now you had
like when you're in
now-
first class. Pull that curtain. You just playing.
now. Don't do it.
All the books are signed. He made me sign all the books, so you can't get that on Amazon. They're all signed.
They are all signed. Let us know if you want one. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Please make sure that you close out your check and say thank you to your server. They have served you guys so well. Please.